The title is probably a little bit misleading only because I rewrote a bunch of it last night. As is my wont, I'm actually going to go off in a bunch of different directions in this presentation on a few different angles of things from my research on radio in its first decade that I find interesting. I hope you will too. I travel around, I look at broadcast facilities all over the country, both current ones and historic ones. I've had kind of a specialty in the last few years of trying to document broadcast facilities that aren't going to be around much longer, which unfortunately is a lot of them these days, and trying to find the oldest of them. You'll see some of those in there. And because I get to do this at home in my hometown of Rochester, I get to share with you a little bit about some of the history of broadcasting right here in Rochester and Western New York, which is a whole fascinating series of stories and people, so we'll get into a little bit of that as well. Along with the main theme of how radio went very quickly from being a hobbyist medium to becoming a much bigger business all in the space of just a few years. So this is probably not the last time you're going to see a picture of this location. This, unfortunately, is what remains these days of sort of the birthplace of commercial American broadcasting. This is the corner of Penn Avenue and Peebles Avenue in Wilkinsburg, Pennsylvania, a somewhat undistinguished eastern suburb of Pittsburgh. Today there is in fact a Wendy's there. It is not the one where I just had lunch, but you'd never know the difference. There's absolutely nothing here, unfortunately, to tell you that what used to be on this site was the home, and then off kind of in what is now the south parking lot to the left of the Wendy's there, the garage and laboratory space of Frank Conrad. He was an engineer at Westinghouse at their works in East Pittsburgh, a few miles away from here. He was an avid experimenter, as most of you know, in amateur radio. He began doing what we would identify as broadcasting from his garage here, actually from the second floor, which was already gone by the time I got there to take this picture a few years back. But it was that early broadcasting that got the attention of his bosses at Westinghouse and led them to say, hey, can you take your radio station, rebuild it over at our plant, and we can actually make something bigger out of it in the fall of 1920. There was an attempt some years back to save the house, or at least to save the garage. As with so many well-meaning attempts at historic preservation, it failed. The garage was demolished. The Wendy's was moved across the street. Yes, there was a perfectly good Wendy's already right across the street. But that's where the Wendy's is now. The bricks from the garage supposedly were dismantled, put into storage. Somebody thought they'd get put in a museum somewhere and rebuilt. To the best of my knowledge, that has not happened yet. There's one brick in my garage. Don't come take it. This is where Conrad rebuilt KDKA, initially as 8ZZ, while he waited for the license to arrive from the Commerce Department. The Westinghouse works in East Pittsburgh. You will sense a theme here when I tell you that although at least here there is a historical marker announcing the events of November 2nd, and yes, by the way, I took this picture on November 2nd of 2020 because I couldn't not drive down there and be there at this spot and at least have my own little private remembrance of the start of something there. And again, as any broadcast historian will tell you, there were lots of other things that were broadcasting before KDKA. People were doing election returns. Before KDKA, people were doing sports. The difference with Westinghouse, and this is where the plant was, the actual building, the K building, where the station was up on the 8th floor roof, again, is gone. It was torn down a few years ago. But the difference with Westinghouse was that Westinghouse was the first company to sense that this could be something more than just an experiment, that they could make a business out of this. And what Westinghouse had that people like Doc Harold in San Jose and the University of Wisconsin in Madison and the folks at AMRAD in Medford, Mass. did not have. They had the PR agents, and they had the contacts in the newspapers, and they had the contacts with the department stores to begin to start making this something bigger. So this is what's left of where KDKA started. I wish there was more to show you. There's not. These days it is a large-scale industrial incubator that's owned by some community development agency. And so although the original building where KDKA was is where that parking lot is now, That other building off to the right there, that was a Westinghouse building. And there are all kinds of small-scale industrial and technology companies in there. So, I mean, at least somebody's doing something interesting with it. I'll give them that. How did KDKA get its call sign? You're going to be seeing a lot of these lists in this presentation. This is from the Radio Service Bulletin put out monthly by the Department of Commerce. Anybody ever read those? Anybody ever dig into them? There's some great reading in these. When I get bored, I can spend hours just going through and looking at these. These started to get published in, I believe, 1915, entirely for the ship-to-shore radio industry. If you were a merchant seaman out on a ship somewhere and you needed to know what were accepting commercial traffic and how much they charged per word and all that good stuff, for 25 cents a year, you wrote off to the government printing office and you got the Radio Service Bulletin mailed to you, and every month it would tell you, here are the new licenses that have been issued for commercial land and ship stations. So there's KDJZ in alphabetical order, belonging to the ship the Montgomery City. There's KDKB, which is shipboard on the Eastern Sword, and KDKC on the Hopatcong. And right in between, they had to issue them a license in some sort of category. So it was a land station. And it just got that alphabetical call there, KDKA. It probably was already licensed at this point. I think it predated 1920. And these lists are all available online. The FCC website actually has a collection of these. And a lot of these, too, I should give credit right away to a site called worldradiohistory.com, which belongs to my friend and fellow broadcaster and historian David Gleason. And he has collected all kinds of phenomenal documentation. A lot of what you see here comes from his collection. Westinghouse was a first in another way, too, because in 1921, before almost anybody else was putting up broadcast stations, period, Westinghouse was already saying, let's put these at our other plants, too, and not just at our plant in East Pittsburgh. And so in rapid succession, over a couple of months in the fall of 1921, at their plant in East Springfield, Massachusetts, on Page Boulevard, they put up a station called WBZ. That was followed then by WJZ at their plant in Newark, and then KYW at their plant in Chicago. WBZ, of course, near and dear to my heart because I worked there from 1992 to 1997. I was there for their 75th anniversary in 1996. And Westinghouse at first, I think, had an idea that some of this was going to be broadcasting. I think they had an idea some of it was just going to allow them to communicate more easily from plant to plant. But there they were, not actually again on this building. The building that they were on was a larger building that was behind this building, which again, if you're sensing a theme here, has since been razed. But this building still stands. Everything that's behind it now belongs to a company that makes rail cars. If you go to Boston in the near future and you ride on the new T-cars that are being rolled out there, you will actually get to ride in cars that are being produced right now in the back of this property. This is what the site looked like relatively recently. This picture, I think, is from about 2005. This one, I should mention, by the way, is from September 19th of this year, which again was the exact centennial of the date that WBZ first went on the air out at this location. I had an excuse to be out there. I wanted to be there that day. Somebody had to do it. So WBZ started from a long wire antenna that was strung between those two towers. First broadcast was actually a remote. They were out at the Big E, the Eastern States Exposition, the state fair for southern New England. They did a big broadcast from the Big E that had the governors of Massachusetts and Connecticut and other notables. Pretty soon they figured out that having a studio on the roof of this building was not terribly convenient, and they moved it to a hotel down the road in the heart of Springfield. But that was the birth of WBZ. And then things started to explode. At the beginning of 1922, there were 20-some stations that existed. By the end of 1922, the number was over 500. It's actually even more dramatic than that, because most of that growth was packed into just a few months in the middle of 1922. And here's where we come into the picture here in Western New York. You can see, if you look down this list of stations in March of 22, which is still pretty early, that there is a station here called WHQ. As with all of these stations, 360-meter wavelength for most broadcasting, 485 if they were broadcasting weather or farm reports. That was considered to be a separate government public service at the time. Again, I'm going to go through a few of these lists here to see who was actually applying for stations at this point, and who thought, gee, A, I have the resources to be able to build a radio station from scratch, and B, I have something to say on my radio station that's going to make people want to listen, and that's going to be a good reason for me to build this. And so you look through the list, and it's everything from individuals, some guy named Warren R. Cox in Cleveland, some guy named Thomas F.J. Howlett in Philadelphia, Louis Wasmer in Seattle, to companies that you've probably never heard of, the Reich-Kummler Company in Dayton, the Pomona Fixture and Wiring Company in California. There were newspapers early on. We know, of course, the Detroit News was early on in this with the station that became WWJ that has roots back even before 1920. The Rochester Times-Union was very, very early on in this too. San Francisco Examiner was on that list there early on. And then you had some enormous radio companies early on, or enormous industrial companies, General Electric. Right there was station WGY in Schenectady. And you can already start to see a little bit of a pattern about who survived. Because we know, as you look down this list, there are a couple of call signs that are still familiar to us even now. We know there is still a WOR in the New York City area. At the time, it was L. Bamberger. We're going to see more of department stores getting involved. We know there's still a WOC in the Quad Cities. WGY, of course, still survives from this list. Most of the rest of these, WHK in Cleveland is still there. The rest of these call signs came and went sometimes very, very quickly. Here's WHQ. WHQ hit the airwaves on March 1st of 1922. This was an ad that they ran in Editor and Publisher magazine, which was the trade periodical for newspapers, basically kind of puffing themselves up and bragging, hey, we're one of the first newspapers to do this. And they took out a full-page ad to do it, which I'm sure was not cheap, boasting that they've installed at heavy expense a large and successful radio broadcasting station. Mark down that name there, Lawrence Hixson, who helped build it for them. We're going to see him again in a few minutes. They're putting articles in the newspaper promoting what they're doing, a daily column devoted to solving amateur radio operators' problems and other constructive radio information. And they are already, as early as March of 1922, understanding what this could be as a promotional tool, because there we are down at the bottom. When considering the profitable Rochester market, remember, the Rochester Times-Union has more daily city circulation than all other papers combined, and we had 4 of them here at the time. So that was not an idle brag. So they were using this already basically as a way to say to advertisers, hey, we're moving into the future, but also buy advertising space in our newspaper, because at the time they weren't selling it on their radio station. So that's WHQ. We're not going to see them much longer, though, and we'll see why in a minute. By April, things are going nuts. This is just one of several pages now of new listings that show up in the April edition of the Radio Service Bulletin. And they're getting a little bit confused even at this point because they don't have a regulatory scheme for this. Everything is still kind of getting licensed as fixed shore stations and getting listed in here with services that are still providing communication back and forth to ships, along with stations that are actually doing broadcasting. And again, we start to see some call signs that you will recognize still to this day. WSB, the Atlanta Journal in Atlanta, shows up here. KRE in Berkeley, California, the station is still there. WBT in Charlotte, WLW, here's Crosley in Cincinnati, understanding, hey, we sell electrical things. We can sell radios to people if they've got something to listen to. Let's get this radio station on the air. KLZ and KOA in Denver show up now. And, oh, look, what's this over in Buffalo, New York? Buffalo gets its first radio stations. First one that shows up that actually went on the air in March and may have been on without a license even earlier, a store called McCarthy Brothers and Ford, nothing to do with the car company as far as I know. They go on with WWT. About 5 weeks later, the Federal Telephone and Telegraph Company, which was a big manufacturer of wireless transmitters and telephone equipment, they hit the air with a much bigger station called WGR. Here's WWT, thanks to my friend and Buffalo historian Steve Cichon. who's got a lot of this stuff up at his Buffalo Stories site. But this is allegedly, I guess, the first broadcast of WWT. Supposedly the first sound that they ever broadcast was the sound of somebody kissing into the airwaves and welcoming Buffalo to radio. Their programming, I guess, didn't get much more inspiring than that, because a few weeks later they went silent temporarily to give listeners a chance to hear on that same single frequency the new WGR, and WGR was so dominant that WWT never came back. One of these many stations that was there for a few weeks and poof. WGR, however, survived. And again, the federal people had resources and a reason to promote something. So they're telling you their new high-power broadcasting station goes on May 21st. They're urging every family within a radius of 30 miles of Buffalo, get your federated crystal radio receiver for $25, which, that's, you're looking at what, like $400 now? In today's money, that was not a cheap investment for you to buy one of their radio receivers as opposed to building one of your own. That building on Elmwood Avenue is still there. I think there's offices and some sort of party hall in there. By May, things are just growing again, leaps and bounds. We're starting to see 4-letter call signs already because they're running out of 3-letter calls. We're starting to see a few more stations that have survived to tell their story through the years. WBAY, the AT&T station in New York, which was the antecedent, again, as John explained yesterday, to WEAF, the toll station that was the first big station to do advertising. Not the first to do advertising, period, but again, the first to get noticed for it, and the first to really make a business out of it. Again, who's getting involved in this? Just about everybody. Not the Ship Owners Radio Service. That one is still actually talking to ships. But there's the Omaha Grain Exchange in Omaha. They're on the air now with WAAW, which eventually would become WOW. Still exists. The Deseret News in Salt Lake City, which had KZN, which eventually became KSL. This was before stations got assigned call letters. But KSL still exists. Out in San Francisco, here's Hale Brothers, the biggest department store in town. They want to sell radios. They put KPO on the air. There's KPO. They put the big towers up on their roof. They put the call letters up there to get attention. That would eventually grow into a much bigger station that was owned by NBC and would become what we now know as KNBR out west. When I say everybody and anybody was trying to get a radio station in these early years, a lot of them probably had no business getting radio stations. Here we are, this is actually a year later, this is 1923, and we're seeing that a summer camp in Chesham, New Hampshire is putting 10 watts on the air, I guess for the kids to play radio that summer. Here's a newspaper in tiny little Fond du Lac, Wisconsin, KFIZ. That one survived, actually. We have theaters trying to do it, maybe to try to keep people coming to theaters instead of just staying at home listening to the radio. Then here we have Canandaigua, New York. Canandaigua, of course, not very far from here, 25 miles or so from Rochester. Not a very big city then or now. Who was putting the radio station on the air in Canandaigua? Curtis and McElwee. I didn't recognize that name. I had to go do some digging to look it up. Curtis and McElwee were the local undertakers in Canandaigua. What were they broadcasting in the summer of 1923 with their mighty 100 watts at 275 meters? There is absolutely no bit of history that I've found that tells what they were doing, aside from the fact that within a few months that radio station ceased to exist. So were they doing funeral services for shut-ins? Were they playing creepy organ music? We don't know. We can only suspect. But it's worth noting that here we are just a year later, and this is all the new stations for June of 1923. And out of these, I can only point to, I think, 2 of them that still have any roots that still exist today. So a lot of these really did come and go pretty quickly. And so you kind of start asking, okay, well, who are the ones who survived and why? Now, let's go back to Rochester here, and we'll rewind back to the summer of 1922. The Times-Union had a lot of trouble, as it turns out, with WHQ, and there are a variety of stories about why. One of the stories is, well, they put it on top of their steel-framed building downtown, and it happened that the framing of the building was fairly resonant at 360 meters and absorbed a lot of the signal. Same story that they tell about the first AT&T station in New York, WBAY. Whatever, after having signed on in March of 1922, by May of 1922, the Times Union was kind of ready to wash its hands of the whole endeavor, apparently. Who do you reach out to in Rochester in 1922 if you want to sell something to somebody who will keep it going? You go to the richest, most successful guy in town. Anybody recognize that guy there? George Eastman, founder of the Eastman Kodak Company. He had built this enormous mansion on East Avenue in Rochester, which, by the way, is still there as part of the George Eastman Museum, if you haven't been over there to visit it. Phenomenal visit, beautifully restored and maintained. You can go check that out. Here he is with his friend Thomas Edison playing with a motion picture camera using Kodak film. They reach out to George Eastman, as you do. And George Eastman, as it happens, in the summer of 1922, is in the process of building his music school, because he's big on giving things back to the community. He was a major funder of the University of Rochester. So he's building the Eastman School of Music on a site right on East Avenue and Gibbs Street downtown, still there today. And in the process of building this in the summer of 1922, George Eastman took over the equipment of WHQ, but not the license. Got a brand new license from the FCC. And on July 11th of 1922, which interestingly is 3 months before the building is completed and actually open to the public, the Eastman School, with the license held by the University of Rochester, but all the money coming out of George Eastman's pocket, presumably, they put station WHAM on the air. Maybe you've heard of it. So WHAM is coming out of the Eastman School even before it's completed. The story that has been told year in and year out over the years, WHAM, that's a really neat name for a radio station. It was handpicked by George Eastman because he liked to pick interesting names for things. He came up with the name Kodak, and he personally selected WHAM because it sounded great. Right? No. Thank you, radio service bulletins. Here we are with the June edition when the license was issued before they went on July 11th of 22. We are still strictly alphabetical order here. Assigned call letters, and sure enough, WHAO went to Lansing, Michigan, WHAN went to Wichita, Kansas, and right in the middle, there's the University of Rochester with WHAM, entirely in sequential order. Did he have a friend at the Commerce Department who said, if you waited on exactly this day, this is what you'll get? Maybe. There is no proof of that, though. Interesting, even here in the middle of 1922, to see what the success rate was years out of these stations. Most of these died a very quick death, in part because they were in places that just couldn't possibly support a radio station yet. Who in Moscow, Idaho had a radio, or Butte, Montana had 2 stations going on in the air at that point, Bluefield, West Virginia. None of these stations made it. The ones that did, there were some that had some academic backing. So RPI in Troy had WHAZ. That one survived and is still there today, albeit under very different ownership. The only other ones we can point to, Westinghouse in Cleveland, KDPM. This was an interesting experiment. There were a lot of experiments Westinghouse was doing because, of course, they had been in the game for a few years now. They were ready to try some new stuff. They said, hey, what if we take our station in Pittsburgh and we start putting in a shortwave transmitter that can send its programming to other locations around the country? Let's build this station in Cleveland and use it as a relay of KDKA. And they did. And it worked, and eventually they moved that even further out into Kansas. So they had the resources and the wherewithal and the talent to try a bunch of this new stuff when other companies were just trying to get something on the air with a few watts, like the Ocean City Yacht Club in Ocean City. Who knows what they were programming? I can't imagine it was much. This, of course, brought to fore the whole question of who's going to end up paying for this, because all these stations are costing money. How is this going to be financed? What is the system of broadcasting going to look like? And different countries, even at this point, have different ways of figuring it out. There was already a pretty active broadcasting scene going on in the UK, thanks primarily to Marconi, which was putting on fairly low-power transmitters in the middle of city cores, often in partnership, again, with department stores, looking at that U.S. model, and to some extent with the help of the General Post Office. By the end of 1922, the British government was already looking and saying, you know what? We don't want this to be commercial radio here. We want this to be a more government-funded, more government-focused system. So by the end of 1922, all these pioneering stations, this is 2LO in London. They celebrate their anniversary next fall in 1922. I would love to do the centennial thing and show up at the site of that. The transmitter from this one has been preserved and is in a museum somewhere in London, and hopefully they'll have that on display. But by the fall of 1922, the early version of the BBC has already come into existence and is already more or less nationalizing these transmitters and is starting to create a national broadcasting system there. We never did that here. Everything was local. Everything was done by individual broadcasters in individual cities, and in some cases you had companies that might have had 2 or 3 or 4, but no more than that. Canada was doing things with a combination of commercial operators. Their national railroads got into the game very early. The Canadian National Railroad put in some of its own transmitters and then basically rented time from commercial entities in a lot of cities to create the Canadian National Railroad Network in the early 20s. And Canada, like Britain early on, said, okay, we're going to start charging people for licenses to own a radio receiver. That never flew here, but if you were in Canada, as early as, I believe, 1926, you had, or 1923, I think, actually, you had to have a license for your radio. And so here is one that somehow got transferred from Mrs. King over to W.S. Marsden, I guess to avoid paying the dollar again, from what I can tell. But there is a license that you had to have available for inspection if the inspectors came around and wanted to check out your radio in 1929 and 1930. So we come back to Rochester. And remember I mentioned the name Lawrence Hixson. Lawrence Hixson is one of my favorite early people in Rochester radio. Died long before I, or most of us at this point, were born. But Lawrence Hixson was an early amateur radio operator here. Before World War I even. He had a very elaborate ham station at his home on Ridge Road in Arundequite, or back then, as they said, on the Ridge Road in Arundequite. He started doing wireless telephony as early as 1920. He was doing broadcasting off his amateur station as early as 1921, as so many of those amateur stations did. And so he was the guy that the Times Union went to in 1922 and said, hey, help us build WHQ. He did. It didn't work out. He was also the guy that George Eastman went to and said, help us build WHAM. At some point, there must have been some kind of falling out. Because after WHAM went on the air, Hixson, who had his own Hixson Electric Company here in town, went his own way. He worked with the Lake Avenue Baptist Church, which still exists up on the north side of town, put in a little station called WABO. WABO survived surprisingly long at broadcast church programs, ended up sharing time with other stations in town. And then in 1925, the Hixson Electric Company put its own radio station on the air, WHEC. Went on the air from the back of the shop. He had a little studio at the Hotel Seneca downtown. I like to believe that my great-great-grandfather, who was a tailor who was in the Hotel Seneca, might have checked out the radio station at some point. I have no way to prove that. But there's Lawrence Hixson. And Hixson's story is a great example of just how quickly the broadcasters who kind of got the business piece of it back then were able to grow what they did. Because Hixson initially put this up, I think in part, simply because he liked building things and wanted to have a radio station to operate. And I think in part because he wanted to promote the Hixson Electric Company. And this thing blossomed on him. By 1929, so here's a radio station that's not even 4 years old yet. And by 1929, they've gone from being 2 people in the back of his electrical parts store on South Avenue. Now they're right in the heart of downtown. Now they're right at 40 Franklin Street, right in the middle of downtown. Anybody local recognize this building here? Yep, the Rochester Savings Bank building, which was brand new, had just gone up at this point. One of the most prominent corners downtown, right across from the biggest department store in the city, Sibley's. Building is still there. It's not a bank anymore, but the building is still there. And in May of 1929, he's got a 4-day celebration going on of how his little radio station is now occupying these deluxe digs up on the top floor of the Rochester Savings Bank building. at 40 Franklin Street. But look carefully here too, because we're learning not just, hey, we're celebrating that we're on the air and serving people, we're telling you what our radio station means to your business, because now this is a commercial entity. Here's WHEC as it appeared in the Savings Bank building in 1929. There were something like 30 people working there by now. They had the fancy reception room. They had the studios with the drapes and the carpets, and the bands were coming in and playing. The equipment was still a little primitive. The transmitter was not there. The transmitter stayed put on what was called the Terminal Building, which is over near what's now the Rochester City School headquarters on Broad Street. That building is still there. I'd love to get up on the roof and see if anything remains of what that installation looked like, because they were there with their transmitter until 37. But they're putting this booklet out for a very specific reason, and it's not just to brag about the fact that, hey, look at us, we're moving into this new building. They want you to do something if you're getting this booklet, because they're telling you now, hey, look, there are 750,000 people within reach of our signal, and it's only a 500-watt signal at this point. And the men are spending $200 a year on their wardrobes. The women are spending $300. They're buying beds and bedding and pillows and stoves and ranges and furniture and automobiles and $2 million worth of radios every year and $50 million of cars. And, wow, if you could visit each home yourself and tell your story of the real services and values in your place of business, couldn't you get this business? Well, guess what? The smiling manager, Stanley S. Burden, would be very glad to discuss your sales problems with you. This is 4 years after they signed on the air. This is only 8 years into the existence of this industry, as an industry. And they're already telling you, here are their happy customers. We've traced more sales through radio advertising. We believe from an advertising standpoint, we sold some Buicks this way at Whiting Buick. They've made a business out of this as early as 1929. Technology was growing too in a lot of other ways. John Schneider, I believe, actually created this diagram, so I owe John the credit for this. But this was something, again, near and dear to my heart, because WBZ, which had started in Springfield, realized fairly early that where the stars were who were going to provide their on-air talents to the station, they were 90 miles away in Boston, as were more of New England's listeners. And so they needed to have a presence in Boston. So remember, they went on the air in September of 1921. Within 3 years, fall of 1924, as WBZA. Initially, WBZA was broadcasting its own separate signal with its own separate programming. Most of the time, the two of them were interfering with each other a lot of the time. They tried moving WBZA to a different frequency. By 1926, and I emphasize 1926, think about how early this still is, they had figured out, with the help of New England Telephone, a way that they could completely synchronize the broadcasts from both of these locations. So again, 1926, they are, at this point, this diagram is actually from a few years later. So in 26, I think they're still at 900 on the dial. But they've got a crystal oscillator in Springfield, and that's feeding the transmitter in Springfield. But they're also dividing the frequency down, first by 9 and then again by 8, and they land at something that's at a frequency that you could transmit over a phone line, 13.75 kilocycles at the time. And they send just that carrier frequency divided down over a phone line, and it gets sent off to the WBZ transmitter at first in downtown Boston. By the time this diagram is made a few years later, they've got a higher powered transmitter outside of Boston in the town of Millis. But the principle was the same. They're dividing the frequency down. They're sending the carrier frequency 90 miles over a phone line. They are remultiplying the frequency several times, and they are using it to regenerate a carrier frequency in Boston to make sure that they are completely synchronizing these two signals so that they're not heterodyning against each other in 1926. It was amazing technology for the time. And again, it took a company like Westinghouse to figure out how to do it. CBS did it a few years later on an even bigger scale. For most of the 30s, they were doing something similar to this between WBBM in Chicago and KFAB in Omaha. They were on the same channel, and they generated their frequency in Chicago. They sent it to Omaha along with the programming, and Omaha was broadcasting synchronously with Chicago at night. There were experiments along the same lines with NBC in New York, with stations in Hartford and in Baltimore. So there was a very real possibility, if regulators had been more into allowing this, you could have had a much more national broadcasting service with the same national programs coming out of synchronized transmitters in multiple cities. The regulators were not really happy about this. They allowed it for a few of these experiments, but they kind of put their foot down about doing more of it in more areas. And that was one of the problems with this, and always has been, is that there are areas where you're going to get self-interference, no matter how hard you try, and especially in Western Mass, where you're right where the ground wave, and then you start getting skywave at night from Boston, they start interfering with each other, and yeah, it's easy to get into a situation where you have more noise. This, once they went to Millis and got higher power, that's from the Hammond Museum of Radio. That's WBZ, when they moved the WBZ call sign and the higher powered license over to Millis in Boston. One of the things that's fun if you go back and you start reading these radio service bulletins is you see the Federal Radio Commission, or its predecessor still at this point, the Department of Commerce, getting a little antsy as more and more people are trying to hear more and more stations on different frequencies as they've opened up more wavelengths for them. It's becoming increasingly problematic that stations with fairly primitive transmitters are drifting off frequency from time to time. What do we do about that? We send your particular zone's radio inspector out in the radio car to measure your frequency, and we actually tell you in the radio service bulletin which stations were doing the best from month to month at maintaining their frequency within the proper number. In this case, I think this is a list of who was within 50 cycles per second. And there's WTIC in Hartford right up at the top there. And you can see these are in large part the really financially successful stations already, the ones that have backers behind them who can afford to invest in the calibrated piezo oscillators, or who can afford to get a crystal oscillator and have the staff that knows how to maintain the frequency precisely. And so sure enough, there's GE in California, and there's GE in Schenectady. Here are the engineers at Purdue at WBAA, that station's still there. There's KDKA, there's BZ. So here's a list in 1926 of the stations that were doing really well technically. These are also, for the most part, stations that still survive to this day. Almost every one of these radio stations is still on the air right now in some form. Sometimes the calls have changed or they've moved cities, but with the exception of Lamar's, Iowa, and Western Union College, and I think the Third Avenue Railway Company in New York, pretty much all the rest of these stations made it. And I think you can argue in part because they had good technical plants that they could afford to maintain early on. Department of Commerce yields to the Federal Radio Commission in 1927. Federal Radio Commission in 1928 issues General Order 40, which is the really big attempt to bring order to the wavelengths. And it does a couple of things, some of them very good, some of them now historically a little bit questionable. One of the things it does is it says, okay, we acknowledge that Canada and Mexico exist and that we've got an obligation to provide some frequencies for their radio stations that we're not going to interfere with. And so it sets aside several frequencies that are either shared with Canada or that are exclusive to Canada. It organizes everybody in 10 kilocycle increments up and down the dial to make sure that everything is laid out evenly, no more of this 360 meter stuff. A lot of the stations that have not been keeping up with the technology, and remember, we're still only 7-8 years into this, a lot of them, they're already saying, you know what, we're going to wipe you off the books at this point because you're not providing a high-quality broadcast service. In some cases, that made sense because some of these were little stations that were only programming a few hours a week or were just being run sort of as hobbies. But it also caught up a whole bunch of stations that belonged to categories that the FRC didn't necessarily want to see get full-time stations. And so this is the point where some of these early stations that belong to educational institutions especially, and in some cases to churches and religious institutions, they got the short end of the stick too. They got ordered to share time with very limited hours. Another general order the year later created daytime-only facilities. A lot of these stations got shuffled off to daytime-only signals. The ones that got the good channels, the ones that got what became the clear channels, were the ones that had business and political muscle. And so you start looking here, and there's WWJ, the Detroit News, on a channel that was actually better than the one they ended up with in the long run. But here's GE, their stations got a channel all to themselves. Here's KOA in Denver with a channel all to itself. Here's WABC, A.H. Grebe, one of the big manufacturers. Here's New York City, RCA's got its channel all to itself there. KFI, the big auto dealership in California and LA. Earl C. Anthony got a channel all to itself. So it's already turning into something of a political battle of who you know and how much power you can exert. And the amazing thing about this is if you know what the radio dial looked like in 1928, you basically know what the radio dial looks like 93 years later. Because even though some of these frequencies got shuffled up a little bit in 1941 when a new treaty went into effect and changed some of these channels, you look at the basic layout, and if you dial up the clear channels even at night, you know how it goes. There's KFI, and then WSM, and then New York, and then Chicago, and then San Francisco, and then you get a Canadian channel after that, and then there's WLW on 700, WOR, WGN. You recognize these all these years later. And so it was this very political action of 1928 of General Order 40 that really kind of set in stone a lot of the broadcast dial as we know it now. It created what would become the graveyard stations higher up the dial, what are now all those little 1 kilowatt signals at 1230, 1240, 1340, and so on. Those channels were created at different locations back then. So studying this list, if you're a historian of broadcast regulation and frequency allocation, this is kind of the Rosetta Stone that shows you here's where it was created and when. So a lot of these stations that got shuffled off, again, were at colleges. WSAJ at Grove City College in Pennsylvania. They claim a heritage back to 1920 with amateur radio there. They got shuffled to one of those graveyard channels. They were sharing time. They kept their AM on the air from that long wire at the engineering building until just about 15 years ago when they said, never mind, we'll just go with the FM. But that was one of the oldest transmitter sites that still existed. We start at this point to be able to see some physical presence from that era that still survives now. Remember I mentioned I enjoy traveling around to see what you can still see that is a physical remnant of these earliest days of broadcasting. This may be one of the earliest broadcast transmitter buildings that was purpose-built for a broadcast transmitter that still exists. This is north of Minneapolis in Coon Rapids, Minnesota, at the site of WCCO. They built this in 1924 for a 5,000 watt transmitter. And what I mean by that essentially is they built it around a 5,000 watt transmitter that filled the entire building in this era. Just for comparison's sake, if you go to your local broadcast equipment vendor right now and say, please sell me a 5,000 watt transmitter, the box you get will be about 1 rack unit wide and about this tall. And if you get it from Nautel, it'll actually have 2 5,000 watt transmitters basically in it. So I'd love to bring some of these engineers back to see just how compact things have gotten. But that was CCO. That building still stands. They replaced it with a bigger one next door in 1931 when they went to 50,000 watts. I fear this site may fall to developers in the next few years, so I'm glad I got out there and got that picture. When I did, that was some of what was being stored inside of there. I'm not sure if anything there is actually from 1924, but you get the idea that these were still pretty primitive buildings. That changed in a hurry. You know, here again is another very, very early site that survived for a long time. This was KGFJ on top of the Oddfellows building on the south side of downtown LA. That long wire antenna was in use up until just a few years ago as KYPA. The antenna, I think, is actually still there. There's some kind of like party space and nightclub up there, and they light it up now because it looks cool, but the station itself finally moved. That was one of the last hammock antennas still in use. But we go from this, which went up originally in 1927. Here we are 2 years later. You said WTIC. There's the palace that the Travelers Insurance Company is building in 1929 to surround their brand new Western Electric 50,000 watt transmitter, from which they're going on the air now with super high power as one of these lucky stations that got the nod in General Order 40 to get 50,000 watts and become one of the elite, if you will. So that building still stands and is still in use from all the way back in 1929. Within a couple of years, we arrived at facilities that are still very much in active use today, both antenna and transmitter building. Again, the insurance companies, here's WSM, We Shield Millions, the life insurance company there, that was National Life in Nashville. And by 1932, they're building this vertical radiator to do 50,000 watts of power on 650 and broadcast the barn dance that becomes the Grand Ole Opry. The story is told there's a train track, the L&N train tracks run right by here, and they had a microphone there, and every day at 1 when the train went by, they'd open the mic in the building and they'd broadcast the sound of the train whistle. This building is still here. They've got a little museum display inside, still in very active use. Up the road in Cincinnati, WLW, Powell Crosley, built the twin of that antenna, same year in 1932. That one is still there too. Very, very threatened by development. They're building some kind of horrible retail and apartment block on the grounds of this tower. And the whole thing, I guess, will be grounded to the ground system. I don't even want to go back and see it once it's built. I prefer to remember it the way it was. But you can see here now, there are plenty of buildings you can still see from the 30s that are still in active use. So that's where I'll kind of end that technological chapter, except to take you real quickly inside here to WLW and show you, here's the Western Electric from 1927 that was then used a few years later to drive the 500,000 watt monstrosity in the new room that they built out back. The thing carried an RCA nameplate. It was actually a hybrid of parts that came. Some of it was GE, some of it was Westinghouse. A bunch of manufacturers played a role in building that. Still there. They're still preserving it to this day. So we'll come back and finish off with a couple of business cases of what happened here in Western New York, so we have a few minutes for comments and questions. I mentioned WGR in Buffalo. WGR was actually only one surviving member of the class of 1922. The other one that started in 22 that survived in some form to this day was a station called WMAK. MAK started up the road in Lockport, which is about 20 miles north of Buffalo, Niagara County. Another one of these typical stories of it was an experimenter, a guy named Ike Lounsbury, working in his lab in Lockport, New York. He wanted to put a radio station on the air. He did. It was called WMAK. He turned his attention to the actual business of broadcasting within a few years, and by 1927, he built this site that was just on the edge of the Niagara-Erie County line in Wheatfield, New York. Close enough to satisfy the FRC that it was still a Lockport station, but it reached Buffalo. And that was WMAK. Within 2 years, Lounsbury had gotten together with not just WGR, but 2 other stations in Buffalo, and had started to build what could have been a model for today's broadcast clusters, because you had 4 radio stations all operating out of the brand new fancy skyscraper right in the middle of downtown Buffalo here, the Rand Building. That was going to be eventually kind of the model for what the Empire State Building would look like. And so they all got together. And here we are. This is 1929. This is, again, 8 years into the growth of this medium. And they have now built $1 million corporation in Buffalo, which, for the benefit of the regulators at the FRC, is not a merger, but they have put together a cooperative effort among 4 of the city's radio stations, which at this point is basically all of the city's radio stations, give or take. And you've now got WGR, WMAK, and then 2 others, WKEN, which was somehow associated with them, and the station that was pretty small at the time called WKBW, which had been started by a preacher in town. And they all got together and said, we're going to form the BBC. Not that BBC, the Buffalo Broadcasting Corporation. And from 1929 onward into the 1940s, they attempted to completely dominate Buffalo radio. They almost got there, too. They would have gotten away with it. But the Buffalo Evening News, which was the other major media entity at the time in Buffalo, finally decided in 1929 they wanted to apply for a radio station, too. They kind of put some political muscle on the FRC and said, you know, there's no rule that says they can't have 4 radio stations, but it's also probably not a really good idea, is it? And so they worked out, and the details of this are still murky, because obviously the newspaper articles don't explain how it all came to be, but somewhere behind the scenes, WMAK and its license got transferred away from the Buffalo Broadcasting Corporation. And the license ended up in the hands of the Buffalo News, which took the license using the same site, same equipment, same license, but they promoted this is a brand new radio station, WBEN, the Buffalo Evening News. That went on the air in 1930 from this location. Buffalo broadcasters, BBC, they weren't done. They took their station WKEN, they just renamed it WMAK so that they could still have WMAK in town. And so they still had 3 radio stations for a while. They eventually shut off WMAK, and it took up until the start of the FCC's chain broadcasting ruling in 1941, which is a whole other story, that's a whole other talk, that basically said you can only own one radio station or one network in a community. Up until then, they had WGR and they had WKBW, arguably 2 of the 3 biggest radio stations in Buffalo, all under this single roof at the Rand Building. Rand Building still has radio in it all these years later. There are 4 FM stations that broadcast from the roof here, and a whole cluster that has its studios on the 13th and 14th floors here that's now owned by Town Square. Ironically enough, you come full circle into the conglomeration of broadcast, and the company that became Entercom and now Odyssey ended up owning WGR, WBEN, and the station that WKBW became, WWKB. So they all came back together. WBEN, by the way, left here in 1941, moved to a site on Grand Island that's still there. This became, ironically, a ship-to-shore radio station called WBL, and that site still sits there up in Wheatfield, New York. You can still go look at it as far as I know to this day. Here in Rochester, the University of Rochester and the Eastman School of Music did not keep WHAM very long. By 1927, they realized they didn't really have a place as a broadcaster per se, and Stromberg Carlson, the giant local company that manufactured telephone equipment, bought the radio station from them. And it was because Stromberg had it that WHAM was able to exercise the muscle to become a Class 1A clear channel on 1150 and then 1180. They moved the towers off the Eastman Theater, went out to a site in Victor, and then eventually to where they are now, a couple of miles from here, over in the town of Chili. And by 1949, they're building this massive Rochester Radio City facility near their factory on Humboldt Street. This building is still there. They put this on the air to put TV on the air in 1949. The TV station is now WROC TV. Still exists, is still in this very building. I would love to see parts of it turned into a museum someday because a lot of it has been very well preserved. That, again, is another talk I could give at some point. And we come back around to our friend Lawrence Hixson. What became of Lawrence Hixson? Well, he's getting a little older. He's seeing radio become a bigger and bigger business. He has succeeded in at least finding a decent frequency for his radio station with the help of a listener petition with 50,000 signatures on it. As the FCC is working its way, or FRC is working its way through General Order 40, he manages to hang on to a decent facility for his radio station. He can keep 500 and then 1,000 watts, which is what he wants, on a decent frequency that's not shared with too many other broadcasters. He's shared primarily with WOKO in Albany at this point. And by 1932, he's ready to sell. Well, if you can't sell your radio station to George Eastman, who has inconveniently checked out a year earlier, again, a completely separate talk for another time, who do you go to? Who's the richest, most important guy in town? Mr. Frank Gannett. Frank Gannett by now owns the Rochester Times-Union, is about to buy the Rochester Democrat and Chronicle, has just gone through a whole trade with William Randolph Hearst so that Hearst gets rid of his papers in Rochester, Gannett gets rid of his papers in Albany, and now they've got newspaper monopolies in each of those cities. No antitrust regulation to stop that back then. And so here we are in 1932, and here we arrive at the point where Lawrence Hixson says, I'm going to sell WHEC to Frank Gannett, and now WHEC becomes part of this larger Gannett entity along with the newspaper, and has a very successful run for another many years, gets a TV station of its own, which still exists, WHEC TV, goes to 5,000 watts. One more name that I'll mention here, just as I'm going through this, this is part of the two-page spread in the Times-Union announcing this exciting sale of WHEC to the Times-Union. Who's running WHEC at this point? A guy by the name of Gunnar WHEC. Gunnar WHEC is almost completely forgotten now, which is a shame, because Gunnar WHEC was a Norwegian immigrant. He had worked for the YMCA in Amsterdam, New York, then comes here to get involved in radio. He becomes one of the first baseball announcers. He's announcing Rochester Red Wings games and persuading the team to put its games on radio for the first time as early as, I think, 1928. He's doing out-of-town games by telegraph. Gunnar WHEC, by 1932, is now running the show here at WHEC. He would continue there. I think he finally retired sometime in the late 50s, early 60s. Very, very familiar voice to a generation before most of ours in Rochester. The only reason you may know him now is you may or may not have heard of his granddaughter. Have you heard of the actress Kristen Wiig? Saturday Night Live and the Bridesmaids movies and all that. Her grandfather was Gunnar WHEC.